The morning Cornelius Slater rode hard across the Kansas plain toward Maude Carter's homestead. The sky above him was the color of a bruise that hadn't quite decided to hurt, yet purple at the edges and a sickly yellow at the center. And he pushed his horse, a broad-chested roan named Pepper, faster than he ought to because the news he carried felt like a coal ember sitting directly against his sternum, burning hotter with every stride. It was the spring of 1882, and the land out here in Barton County, Kansas, was the kind of stubborn, beautiful country that broke men in half and occasionally, if they were very lucky or very stupid, made them whole again. The Homestead Acts had drawn hundreds of families west, promising 160 acres of government land to anyone who could hold it for 5 years, build something on it, and coax something green from it. Most couldn't manage all three. Maude Carter had managed all three alone, which said everything about her that needed saying. Cornelius had first heard about the bank's plan at Hector Finley's general store in the town of Crestwood, where he worked a few days a week as a hired hand and freight hauler. He was stacking sacks of flour in the back room when he overheard two men from the First Territorial Bank of Crestwood talking near the front counter, not bothering to lower their voices the way men don't bother to lower their voices when they think no one worth considering is listening. The banker's name was Aldous Prentice, a soft-bellied man with a face like unbaked bread dough, and he was talking to his lawyer, a ferret-looking fellow named Grimes, about the Carter place. Woman's 3 months behind on the secured loan her husband took before he died, Prentice said, tapping a paper on the counter. We've been patient. We'll ride out Friday morning and take the deed or take what's owed. Either way, that land comes to us. Cornelius had gone very still behind the flour sacks. He knew Maude Carter the way everyone in the county knew her by reputation first, because a woman running 160 acres alone with a 9-year-old boy, and doing it successfully, was the kind of thing people talked about. And then by sight, because he had seen her twice at church, and once at the Independence Day social in town the previous summer, when she had laughed at something the preacher's wife said, and the sound of it had done something unreasonable to the inside of Cornelius's ribs. He was 31 years old. He had come to Kansas from Tennessee 8 years prior with $30 and a strong back, had hired himself out, had saved, had tried homesteading once on his own and lost the crop to a grasshopper plague that had stripped the land bare in 3 days flat. He was not a man who gave up easily, but he was also a man who had learned to be honest with himself about what he was and wasn't. He was a good worker. He was decent with animals and fair with people. He was, by every measure he could apply to himself, an ordinary man. But the laugh he had heard from across the churchyard last July had not felt like an ordinary sound, and he had thought about it more than once since then, usually when he was alone at night in the bunk at the Ridley Ranch where he slept. He finished the flour sacks. He thanked Hector Finley for the afternoon's work, collected his 40 cents, and saddled Pepper before the sun had moved another hand's width across the sky. The Carter homestead sat 7 miles south and east of Crestwood, at the edge of a shallow creek called Ember Creek that ran full in spring and half empty in summer, and was the only reliable water on that stretch of plain. Cornelius had ridden past it once, maybe twice, on his way between jobs, and he remembered the layout clearly because it was the kind of place that lodged in a man's memory whether he meant it to or not. There was a solid, square-built sod house with a real wooden door and 2 glass windows, which was more than a lot of homesteads could boast. There was a good-sized vegetable garden on the south side, a small barn that looked repaired and re-repaired so many times it had become a kind of patchwork monument to stubbornness, and a chicken coop with a fence that meant business. The whole property had an air of being deeply, personally looked after, the way a thing looks when one person has poured themselves entirely into it. He came up the track at a canter and slowed Pepper to a walk as the house came into sight, not wanting to alarm anyone. He could see a figure in the garden, a woman in a dark work dress and a wide-brimmed hat, crouched low between two rows of young plants, pulling something from the earth. She did not look up right away, and he was 20 yards away before she sat back on her heels and turned to see who was coming. Maude Carter was 28 years old. She had dark brown hair that she kept pinned up under her hat when she was working, and a face that was weathered in the way that working faces get weathered. Not hardened exactly, more like tempered, like metal that had been through a fire and come out cleaner. Her eyes were gray-green and direct in a way that some people found unsettling and Cornelius found, in that first real moment of looking at her clearly, to be the most straightforward and honest thing he had ever seen. She stood up from the garden and watched him approach, one hand going to the small of her back, which ached, because it always ached in April when the digging was heavy. Cornelius pulled Pepper to a stop at the garden fence and touched the brim of his hat. "Good afternoon, ma'am. You're Maude Carter." "I am," she said without ceremony, wiping her hands on her apron. "And you're the Slater man who hauls freight for Hector Finley sometimes." He was a little surprised she knew him, and she saw that surprise and offered nothing to explain it. She simply waited because she was a woman who had learned that waiting cost less than rushing and paid better dividends. "Yes, ma'am." Cornelius Slater. He cleared his throat. "I came out here because I heard something in town today that I thought you ought to know. Aldous Prentice from the First Territorial Bank is planning to ride out here Friday morning. Him and his lawyer. They're saying there's a secured loan, 3 months in arrears, and they intend to collect the deed or what's owed." He watched her face as he said it, the way a man watches a face for what it might tell him, for the flinch or the fear or the collapse. What he saw instead was something he had not predicted. Her jaw tightened slightly. Her eyes did not change. She pressed her lips together for exactly 2 seconds, and then she let a breath go through her nose, slow and controlled, the way a person exhales when they are not surprised at all, only tired of being right. "I know," she said. He blinked. "Ma'am, I know about the bank. I've known about the bank." She pulled her gardening gloves off, one finger at a time, with a kind of deliberate calm. "I've been corresponding with Prentice for 4 months. I know he's coming Friday." She looked at Cornelius Slater directly, and something in her expression shifted, just a degree or two towards something he could not name, not warmth exactly, not yet, but an openness, like a window unlocked even if not yet swung wide. "I appreciate you riding out to tell me. That was kind of you." He opened his mouth to say something useful, like that he was glad she knew, that he hoped it worked out, that he was sorry for the trouble, all the correct and polite things a man says when he discovers the person he rushed to save has the situation well in hand. None of those things came out. What came out instead was, "What are you planning to do about it?" She tilted her head and looked at him with those gray-green eyes, and for a moment the wind moved across the open plain behind him and carried the smell of new grass and creek water, and a meadowlark sang from somewhere to the west, and it was so thoroughly, achingly quiet between them that he felt the question hanging in the air like smoke. "I have money," she said. "Not the full amount, but most of it. And I have something Prentice wants more than the land." She paused, then seemed to decide he had earned the rest of the sentence. "There's a water rights agreement that my husband Thomas signed with the Hadley family the year before he died. The Hadleys want it formalized in a way that benefits their north pasture. Prentice holds paper on the Hadley spread too. If I bring the agreement to the table on Friday and the partial payment, it gives Prentice something to broker between 2 properties he holds interest in. That's leverage." Cornelius stared at her. "You worked that out yourself." "Who else was going to work it out?" she asked, and there was no bitterness in it, only fact. He sat there on Pepper in the afternoon light and felt something turn over in him slowly, like a wheel finding a new groove. She was not a woman who needed rescuing. She was a woman who had been managing a situation, alone, for months. He had ridden 7 miles to warn her, and she had known all along. And instead of feeling foolish, which he supposed he ought to, he felt something closer to the opposite. He felt, with a sudden and unexpected certainty, that he wanted to stay. "Are you going to need anyone else at the table on Friday?" he asked. She looked at him steadily for a moment. "Are you offering?" "I might be." The silence stretched another beat. Then Maude Carter did something he did not expect. She almost smiled. It was a very small thing, just a slight shift at the corner of her mouth, but it was there. "I could use a witness," she said. "Someone outside the transaction who can verify what's agreed to. A hired hand who hauls freight for Hector Finley might do well enough." "I can witness things," he said very seriously. "I expect you can." She put her gloves in her apron pocket. "You're welcome to water your horse at the creek. There's coffee on if you want it while I explain the rest of the situation. I'd prefer you to understand it clearly before Friday." He got down off Pepper and walked the roan toward the creek, and Maude Carter went inside. And that was how it began, quietly and practically and without any ceremony at all, which was perhaps the most fitting beginning possible for two people like them. The inside of the sod house was neat in the way that small spaces get when the person keeping them cannot afford disorder. Everything had a place and was in it. There was a table with 2 chairs and a third stool. There was a cast iron stove that had been blacked recently. There were 2 shelves of books above the window, which surprised him, and he found himself reading the spines as he came in: a Bible, a farmer's almanac, a battered copy of something by Dickens, and several books of a more practical nature. There was a rug that had been braided from strips of old cloth, circular and well-centered on the earthen floor. There was a child's drawing pinned to the wall near the door, a horse that looked mostly like a dog but was clearly intended with great seriousness. "My son Eli is at school in town today," Maude said, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. "He stays with the Finley family on school nights and comes home Fridays. Hector Finley's family. His sister-in-law, Clara, she's been kind to us." She set a cup in front of him and sat down across the table with her own. "Eli is 9. He's a good boy. Doesn't cause trouble." Cornelius wrapped his hands around the cup. "How long has it been since your husband passed?" 2 years in November." She said it the way people say things they have said many times, not without feeling, but without the rawness of new feeling. "Thomas was a good man and a decent farmer. He borrowed against the land to buy seed stock and equipment when we first arrived. It was a reasonable decision at the time. The spring floods took the first crop, and then he took sick the following winter and didn't come back from it." She looked at her coffee. "The bank gave me a year's grace because Prentice is not entirely without conscience. But grace has a clock on it, so you've been working this place alone for 2 years. Eli helps when he's here." She looked up. "Don't look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I need comforting. I don't. I need Friday to go well." He nodded once, respecting the boundary she had drawn. "Tell me about the water rights agreement." She pulled a folded paper from a leather folio she kept on the shelf and spread it on the table between them. It was a document written in Thomas Carter's careful hand, outlining the terms of a shared usage agreement for Ember Creek, which ran along the eastern border of the Carter land, and then curved north across the corner of Hadley land before turning toward the open plain. The Hadleys had been after access to a longer stretch of the creek bank for their cattle for years, and Thomas had agreed in principle, but never had the agreement witnessed or filed. "If I file this now and bring Prentice in as the party to formalize it, he becomes the broker between me and the Hadleys," Maude explained, tracing the language with her finger. "He stands to benefit from both sides of the arrangement. That gives him a reason to accept partial payment and extend my time rather than foreclose. A foreclosed property earns him the land. A negotiated arrangement earns him fees from 2 families." Cornelius read the document carefully. He was not an educated man in the formal sense, but he could read well enough and he had a good mind for how things fit together. "The language here says Thomas agreed to grant access between April and September only. That's not what the Hadleys want. They want year-round." "I know. So you'll negotiate the seasonal terms in exchange for the extension." "Yes, I give them more months. They pay me a small annual fee for the access. That income helps me meet the bank payment." She folded her hands on the table. "It's tight, but it works if Prentice agrees." "And if he doesn't?" She met his eyes. Then I fight it in the county court, which I have standing to do because the original loan terms had a provision Thomas negotiated that required 60 days written notice before any foreclosure proceeding. Prentice has not given me 60 days written notice. He's given me 38. Cornelius sat back slowly. You've been preparing for this for a while. Since January. You've read the loan documents. Every word, twice. He looked at her across that small table in that small, well-kept room, with the afternoon light coming through the real glass window and laying a stripe of gold across the table between them, and he thought that he had never in his life met a woman who managed to be simultaneously so entirely self-contained and so quietly magnificent. It was a disarming combination. "I'll be here Friday," he said. "I haven't asked you to be. I'm volunteering." She studied him for a moment. "Why?" It was a fair question, and he took it seriously, which she noticed. He didn't laugh it off or give her the easy answer. He turned his coffee cup between his hands and thought about it genuinely before he spoke. "Because what you're doing here is right," he said. "You've worked this land, you've taken care of your boy, you've managed a situation that would have broken most people, and you've done it without asking anyone for anything. That's worth standing next to." He paused. "And because I think I'd like to know how Friday goes." The honest truth of that last part, the personal interest underneath the practical one, hung in the air between them, and Maude Carter did not dismiss it. She looked at it, acknowledged it internally with the same clear-eyed directness she applied to everything, and then she said, "You can sleep in the barn. There's a cot in the tack room that's clean. We eat at 6 in the morning, and I don't keep late hours." "That suits me," Cornelius said. And that was how Cornelius Slater came to be sleeping in Maude Carter's barn on the night of the 23rd of April, 1882, with Pepper stabled comfortably in the stall beside the old mule, and the sound of Ember Creek running softly in the dark outside. He woke before dawn, which was his habit, and found that Maude was already up, already at the stove, already making cornbread and frying salt pork with the calm efficiency of a woman who had never once in her adult life had the luxury of a slow morning. He stood in the doorway of the sod house, and she glanced at him over her shoulder. "There's water in the bucket outside for washing," she said. "Breakfast in 20 minutes." He washed his face and hands in the cold morning air and came back in to find the table set with 2 places, which struck him for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, the simple domestic act of it, as something he had not experienced in a very long time. They ate mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, not the silence of 2 people with nothing to say to each other, more the silence of 2 people who were each, in their separate ways, thinking about the same thing, and finding that the presence of the other person made the thinking easier. "Tell me about yourself," Maude said, refilling her coffee, and he understood from her tone that it was a practical request, not a personal one. She was assessing what kind of witness she had acquired. He told her the broad strokes honestly. Tennessee, 8 years in Kansas, hired work, freight hauling the failed Homestead. He mentioned briefly a woman in Hayes City he had nearly married 4 years ago who had eventually decided she wanted a man with more of a future in front of him and had married a hardware merchant instead. He said this last part without self-pity, which Maude noticed and approved of. "And now?" she asked. "Now I'm 31 and employed by the week and sleeping in a barn," he said, and the slight wry quality in his voice made her look up from her plate, and their eyes met. And for the first time she actually smiled at him, a real one, not the fractional thing from the day before, a genuine smile that changed her whole face and reached her eyes and did something to the inside of his chest that he had been half expecting and had not at all prepared for. "Well," she said, "at least the barn is a clean one." "It is," he agreed. "Finest barn I've slept in since Sedgwick County." She shook her head slightly, still smiling, and looked back at her plate, and Cornelius Slater ate his breakfast and felt, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He spent Wednesday helping around the property, because there was help needed and he was there, and it seemed wrong to sit idle. He fixed a broken fence rail on the north side of the chicken yard. He patched a section of the barn roof where the spring rains had found a gap. Maude worked alongside him for part of the afternoon, and they moved around each other with a surprising ease, talking when there was something worth saying and comfortable when there wasn't. She was not a woman who filled silence with noise, and neither was he, and this turned out to be one of the more important things they had in common. Friday was coming, and the closer it came, the more he could feel it in the quality of her focus, the way she went over her documents each evening at the table after supper, rereading language, making small notes in pencil in the margins. She was not frightened. She was preparing. But there was something in her eyes some evenings, when she didn't know he was watching, that was quieter and more tired than her daytime self. Something that spoke of the accumulated weight of 2 years of managing everything alone. He wanted, very much, to say something about that. He did not know how to say it without crossing a line she had not invited him to cross. Thursday evening, after the dishes were done and the lamp was lit and Maude was at the table with her papers again, Cornelius was sitting near the door working a crack in his saddle leather with oil and a rag when she suddenly put down her pencil and rubbed her eyes with the heels of her hands. "Are you frightened?" he asked, quietly. She lowered her hands and looked at him, and for a moment he thought she might rebuff the question the way she sometimes did when things got too close to the personal. But she didn't. "Not frightened," she said. "Just tired of having to be so certain about everything all the time. If I show doubt, Eli feels it. If I show doubt to the bank, they use it, so I don't show it." She looked at her papers. "It gets heavy is all. You don't have to be certain with me," he said. "I'm not going to use it against you." She looked at him for a long moment, and something passed across her face that was difficult to read and beautiful in its difficulty, like a sentence in a language you're still learning. "I know," she said, very quietly. He went back to the saddle leather and she went back to her papers, but the room felt different after that. Something had opened just a little, like that window he'd imagined before, just enough for air to move through. Friday morning came on bright and already warm, the sky clear and pale blue from horizon to horizon, the kind of day that made the plains look deceptively gentle. Maude was up before him again. When he came in from the barn, she was dressed in her best dress, a deep blue calico that had been pressed careful and neat, her hair pinned up properly under a clean hat. She looked composed and deliberate, and Cornelius thought she looked extraordinary. Eli had come home late Thursday night from town, brought out by the Finley family's eldest boy on horseback, and he was now sitting at the table eating his breakfast with the focused intensity that 9-year-old boys bring to everything. He had his mother's gray-green eyes and his father's darker coloring, and he was clearly, even at 9, going to be a serious person when he grew up. He had looked at Cornelius with frank assessment the night before and asked, "Are you helping Mama with the bank?" "Doing my best to," Cornelius had said. "Good," Eli had said, with the finality of a person who had considered all the available options and reached a verdict. After breakfast, Maude sent Eli to the barn to do the morning feeding and to stay there until she called him. She set her folio of documents on the table with her partial payment, counted out in bills and coin, sitting in a neat stack beside it. Then she looked at Cornelius. "When they arrive," she said, "I want you near the door, not blocking it but present. I want Prentice to understand this isn't a lone woman he can roll over." "Understood." "Don't speak unless I ask you to, or unless something legal is being misrepresented, then correct it." "Understood." She looked at him, and something softer moved across her face for just a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for being here." "You didn't have to be." "I wanted to be," he said, and left it simple because the simple version was the true version. They heard the horses about 40 minutes later, 2 of them, coming up the track from the road. Maude stood at the window and watched Prentice and Grimes come up the path, and her jaw was set and her hands were still at her sides, and she breathed once slowly through her nose. "Ready?" Cornelius asked from near the door. "I've been ready since January," she said, and opened the door herself before they could knock. Aldous Prentice was exactly as Cornelius had observed him in the store, soft and pale, and accustomed to being the most important person in any given room. His lawyer Grimes was narrow-faced and carried a leather case and looked at everything with small, evaluating eyes. They both stopped short when they saw Cornelius standing inside the doorway, and Prentice's face went through a quick recalibration. "Mrs. Carter," Prentice said, touching his hat, "I see you have company." "Mr. Cornelius Slater, a resident of Barton County," Maude said pleasantly, "here as my witness. Please come in, gentlemen." They came in and sat where she directed them, across the table from her, and she sat opposite and placed her documents between them, and Cornelius took his position near the door, arms loose at his sides, watching the room with the quiet steadiness of a man who could, if required, fill a space considerably more forcefully than he was currently choosing to. What happened in the next 2 hours was one of the finest things Cornelius Slater had ever witnessed. Maude Carter negotiated. She was not aggressive and she was not apologetic. She was clear and she was precise, and she knew every word of every document on that table better than the banker who held them. When Prentice tried to assert that the grace period had been informal and therefore not legally binding, she produced a letter from his own office, dated 14 months prior, that described the terms explicitly. When Grimes tried to reframe the loan terms in language more favorable to the bank's position, she corrected him with the specific clause number and page and quoted the relevant sentence from memory. Cornelius spoke twice. Once when Grimes misrepresented the 60-day notice requirement, reading aloud the actual text from the document and stating clearly that the bank had provided 38 days, not 60. And once when Prentice tried to claim the water rights agreement was invalid because it hadn't been witnessed at signing, at which point Cornelius said quietly, "The provision in question requires witness at filing, not at signing. Kansas Territorial Law, 1876. I can ride to the courthouse and come back with the relevant statute if you'd like to wait." He could not actually quote the specific statute by name. But he knew the principle was right, having thought about it carefully since Maude explained it, and the confident precision of his delivery made Prentice look at Grimes and Grimes look at his papers, and neither man challenged it. They reached an agreement before noon. Prentice accepted the partial payment. The water rights agreement was formally witnessed by all 4 parties present and would be filed with the Hadleys at the county seat the following week. Maude's repayment extension was set at 14 months, with the water access fee from the Hadleys to offset the difference. Prentice walked away with a brokered deal between 2 properties he held interest in, which was, as Maude had predicted, more valuable to him than a foreclosed piece of land he'd then have to sell. When the 2 men rode away down the track, Maude stood in the doorway and watched them go. She did not move for a long moment. Then she let out a breath that seemed to come from very deep inside her, a breath that had been held for 4 months and possibly longer, and she put one hand on the doorframe to steady herself for just a moment. Cornelius came to stand beside her, not too close, but close enough. "You did that," he said. "Every word of it." She nodded, looking out at the plain. "We did it," she corrected. He didn't argue. After a moment she called for Eli, who came barreling out of the barn at a run, and who was told in the briefest possible terms that everything was going to be fine, and who received this news by grabbing his mother around the middle with both arms and pressing his face into her side. And Maude put her hand on his hair and looked over his head at the sky with an expression of such profound, uncomplicated relief that Cornelius felt it like something physical in his own chest. He should have saddled Pepper that afternoon and ridden back to Crestwood. His work here was done. There was nothing keeping him on the Carter property except his own willingness to stay, and he was aware of how that might look, aware of the precariousness of a man finding reasons to linger where he had not been formally invited to remain. But Maude, after she had sent Eli back to his chores and had put the kettle on for midday tea with a kind of returning to normal business efficiency, said, without turning around from the stove, "I suppose you'll be heading back to town." "I suppose so," he said, and did not move. She turned around and looked at him, and they looked at each other for a moment in the way two people look at each other when they are having two conversations simultaneously, one out loud and one that is entirely composed of the space between words. "There's a fence on the east side of the property that needs a full replacement," she said. "It's been on my list since last fall. I've been too busy with everything else." "I'm good with fence work," he said. "I would pay you," she said, firmly and immediately, and he understood that this was important to her, that she was not accepting charity and was not offering sentimentality, that this was a practical arrangement between two practical people. "Fair enough," he said. He stayed through the weekend and into the following week. He rebuilt the east fence. He helped Eli plant the second row of the vegetable garden on Saturday morning, while Maude was inside baking bread, and Eli talked to him with the frank, unself-conscious openness of children who have decided to trust someone, telling him about school and about his friends, and about the horse he intended to own when he was older, which would be black and have a white star and be the fastest horse in Barton County. "That's a specific horse," Cornelius said, pressing seeds into the row. "I've been thinking about it for a while," Eli said seriously. On Sunday they went to church in Crestwood, all three of them, Cornelius on Pepper and Maude and Eli in the small wagon pulled by the old mule, whose name was apparently Ferdinand, though no one seemed to know how he had come by this name. The churchyard was busy, and Cornelius noticed people noticing them, the way people in small communities notice configurations that are new, and he felt the slight self-consciousness of it but set it aside. Maude seemed entirely unbothered. Clara Finley, Hector's sister-in-law, found them after the service and embraced Maude warmly and asked after the situation with the bank. And Maude explained it briefly, and Clara's face went through several kinds of relief in quick succession. Clara was a round-faced, cheerful woman who managed to communicate warmth in the same square footage of expression that most people required several sentences. She looked at Cornelius with the particular appraisal of a woman who has a great deal of interest in whether the people she cares about are well situated and said, "You're the one who rode out to warn her." "Yes, ma'am." "And stayed to help." "Yes, ma'am." She smiled at him with a warmth that was not quite subtle. "Well," she said, "it's good to know there are still some men in this county with the sense to do the right thing." He rode back to the homestead with them after church, and he didn't even question it any more by this point, didn't even apply the practical language of fence work and fair wages to the decision. He rode back because he wanted to, because the 7 miles between Crestwood and the Carter homestead felt like the most purposeful 7 miles he traveled in any direction, and because something was happening between himself and Maude Carter that he did not want to interrupt by leaving too soon. It happened slowly, the way things that matter tend to happen, not in a single dramatic moment but in accumulation. It was in the evenings after supper when they sat outside on the 2 chairs that Maude brought out from the sod house and watched the sunset turn the plains orange, and Purple and Eli ran around in the failing light catching fireflies in a jar. It was in the conversations they had in those evenings, real conversations, the kind where you say things you haven't said to anyone before because you haven't found the person who would receive them properly. She told him about Thomas, not with grief exactly but with honesty, how he had been a good husband and a genuinely kind man, and how she had loved him and how losing him had remade her into something she had not previously been, tougher in some ways, more solitary, more certain of what she was capable of. She said this without bitterness and without self-congratulation, just as observed fact. He told her about the grasshopper plague, about watching 3 months of work disappear in 2 days, about the particular quality of despair in that, the scale of helplessness, and how he had eventually understood that the only answer to that kind of loss was to get up the next morning and do the next thing, which was not a profound insight but was the truest one he had. "You're not a man who quits," she observed one evening. "No," he agreed. "I don't think I am." She looked at him sideways in the last of the light. "That's a useful quality in Kansas." "I understand it's occasionally necessary," he said, and she smiled, and the fireflies were starting to come up from the grass, and Eli was running after them with his jar, and the evening was warm and long the way May evenings are in the Kansas plain, and something settled over Cornelius Slater like a blanket he had not known he needed until it was there. He kissed her for the first time on the 18th of May, 1882, which was a Thursday, and it happened the way those things happen when two careful, self-contained people finally stop being quite so careful. They had been walking the perimeter of the property after supper, which had become a habit, checking the fence lines and the garden borders and the creek level, all practical things, all genuine, but also just walking together in the early evening because they both, by now, knew what it was and were only negotiating the timing. The creek was running fast with snowmelt from somewhere north, and they stood at the bank watching it, and she said something about the water rights agreement and how the Hadleys had agreed to the extended terms without much argument, and he said that was good, and she said yes, and then they were both quiet, and he turned to look at her profile, and she turned at the same moment to look at him, and the proximity was closer than it had been in daylight, and the evening had gone soft and golden around them. "Cornelius," she said very quietly. "Yes," he said, equally quietly, and then closed the remaining distance and kissed her gently and carefully, and with the full attention of a man who understands that some moments cannot be replicated and should not be rushed. She kissed him back, not shyly. She was not a shy woman, but with a tenderness that surprised him, given how guarded she generally was, and he understood that what she was giving him in that moment was something she gave very sparingly and very deliberately, and he held the weight of that as carefully as he had ever held anything in his life. When they stepped back from each other, she looked at him with those gray-green eyes in the golden evening light, and she said, "You should know that I don't do things halfway." "Neither do I," he said, "and I come with a 9-year-old boy and 160 acres of hard land and a mule named Ferdinand and more opinions than is probably comfortable." "I'm aware of all of those things," he said. "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." "We do," he agreed. They walked back to the house in the long light, not touching, but close, and something between them had shifted irrevocably, and they both knew it, and neither one made a fuss about it because they were who they were, and making a fuss was not their nature. He went to Crestwood the following day, and had a conversation with Hector Finley that involved some amount of directness on Cornelius's part about his intentions, and some amount of considered opinion on Hector's part about what it took to make a go of a homestead, and ended with a handshake that meant something without either man specifying exactly what. Then he collected his wages and rode back to the homestead. He spoke to Eli that same afternoon, sitting on the fence rail outside the barn while Eli was mucking out the stall. He explained, in language appropriate to a 9-year-old's understanding, that he thought very highly of Eli's mother, and that he intended to court her properly if she was willing, and that he would never try to replace Eli's father, who by all accounts had been a good man, but that he hoped to be a person Eli could come to rely on. Eli listened to all of this with the serious expression he applied to most things and then said, "Can you teach me to rope?" "I can teach you to rope," Cornelius said. "All right," Eli said, and went back to mucking the stall, which was as definitive an endorsement as Cornelius supposed he was going to get. The summer came on fast and hot, the way Kansas summers did, arriving without apology and taking over the whole landscape. The garden grew with a vigor that Maude tended with careful attentiveness, and the creek held better than average for the season, which helped. Cornelius formalized his arrangement with Maude in May, both the personal one and a practical working one, taking over the heavier physical labor on the property in exchange for his board and a small wage that she insisted on, and beginning to invest his own savings, accumulated over 8 years of hired work, into the homestead. There were people in town who had opinions about this arrangement. This was, in 1882, entirely expected. A widow woman and a single man working the same property was the kind of situation that generated commentary, some of it kind, some of it less so. Maude heard most of it secondhand and ignored most of what she heard, which was her approach to most external noise that had no bearing on the actual running of her life. There was one Sunday after church when a woman of some social standing in Crestwood made a remark within Maude's hearing about the propriety of the situation, specifically using the word reputation, in a way that was not meant to be complimentary. Maude turned and looked at the woman with the full, clear, gray-green directness of her gaze and said, "My reputation is that I've held this land for 2 years alone and kept my son fed and educated and paid my debts. I'm comfortable with that reputation. Thank you for your concern." She turned away, and Cornelius, who had been standing close enough to hear the exchange, had to look at the sky for a moment to manage the expression on his face. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly once they were walking away. "I didn't have to," she agreed, "but it was accurate." He laughed, a genuine full one, and she glanced at him sideways and her mouth curved, and they walked to the wagon together, and it was, in its small way, one of his favorite memories of her. By July they had become, to any observer, what they in fact were to each other. He was not yet a formal part of the household in the permanent sense, maintaining a degree of propriety by keeping his sleeping quarters in the tack room. But he was present every day, and he and Maude had conversations that were the conversations of people building something together, practical and personal at once, talking about the property's future and Eli's future, and carefully beginning to talk about their own. He proposed to her in August. He had not planned a great ceremony. He was not by inclination a man given to great ceremony, and she was not by temperament a woman who required it. What he had planned was honesty. They were sitting on the outside chairs in the evening, as had become their custom, the sun going down behind the flat horizon in bands of deep orange, Eli long since inside and asleep. He said her name and she turned, and he said, "I want to marry you, Maude. I want to make this place ours and build it forward together. I know you can do all of it without me. You've proven that. I'm not offering because I think you need me to. I'm offering because I believe that together we do something better than either of us alone, and because I'm in love with you and I want to spend my life here." She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating exactly, processing in the way she processed everything with the full, unhurried attention she gave to things that mattered. "You understand what you're taking on," she said. "The land, the debt, the boy. I understand completely. And you know that I'm not easy," she said. "I have opinions about everything and I change my mind slowly and I keep my own counsel." "I know that," he said. "Those are among the things I love about you." She looked at him for a long time in the evening light, and her face was very still in the way it got when she was deciding something, and he waited, because he had learned to wait for her without impatience, which was perhaps one of the most important things he had learned in his life. "Yes," she said. He took her hand. She let him take it. They sat there together in the falling dark with the fireflies coming up from the grass and the creek running quietly in the distance and the plains all around them, wide and enormous and indifferent in the way beautiful things often are, and none of it seemed threatening, only large and alive. They were married on the 15th of September, 1882, in the Crestwood Church, with Clara Finley as Maude's witness and Hector Finley as Cornelius's, and Eli standing beside his mother in a coat that had been let out at the seams and re-hemmed at the wrists. The ceremony was brief and sincere, and both of them meant every word of it, which is not always the case and is the important thing when it is. Clara Finley cried, which she had informed Maude she would do in advance, and had not apologized for. Hector Finley shook Cornelius's hand after with the particular intensity of a man who wants to communicate something important without saying it aloud. Afterward there was a small gathering at the church hall with food brought by the congregation, because in 1882 in small Kansas towns, weddings and funerals were both occasions for the community to demonstrate its better instincts, and people brought pies and potato dishes and cold roast chicken, and a cake that Clara had made herself with dried apricots from last fall's stores. It was, by the measures of the time and place, a genuinely festive afternoon. Eli ate an unreasonable quantity of cake and was eventually found behind the hall trying to teach the preacher's dog to sit, with moderate success. Cornelius and Maude rode back to the homestead that evening in the wagon, with Eli asleep between them, listing sideways against Cornelius's arm, and the sky was enormous and full of stars the way only plain skies get, and Maude looked up at it and then looked at Cornelius and said, "Well, here we are. Here we are," he agreed. She put her hand through his arm and leaned her head very slightly against his shoulder, which for Maude Carter was an extravagant and deliberate gesture, and he put his cheek against her hair for a moment, and the mule Ferdinand walked steadily forward through the dark, and the stars turned slowly overhead. The fall of 1882 brought with it all the work that falls bring to farming country, the harvest and the storing and the winterizing, and Cornelius threw himself into it, with a determination that came not just from necessity but from investment, the genuine emotional investment of a man who was no longer working someone else's land but his own. He and Maude worked side by side through October and into November, cutting and drying and storing and repairing, and Eli helped when he was home, and the whole enterprise felt, for the first time in a long time on that property, like a thing that had enough hands for the size of it. The financial situation improved through the fall. The Hadley water access fee came in as agreed in October, a small but meaningful sum. Cornelius had sold his own accumulated savings, modest but real, into 2 new pieces of equipment that increased their efficiency for the following spring. The bank payment was made on time in November, ahead of schedule by 2 weeks, and Maude noted this in her ledger with a small notation that said simply, "Current." He saw her write that and understood completely what it meant to her. Winter in Kansas was its own particular character, long and gray and brutal by turns, capable of producing storms that could strand a person 50 yards from their own door. They had one such storm in late January, a 3-day blizzard that closed the world down to the radius of the property and made the outdoors a moving wall of white. They kept the animals alive and the stove burning, and were not, in truth, sorry for the forced proximity. Eli, stranded from school for 4 days, filled the time by demanding that Cornelius teach him to play checkers, which Cornelius did, and then was repeatedly beaten at checkers by a 9-year-old with the strategic instincts of a general, which he bore with admirable composure. Those days inside, close and warm, with the storm outside and the lamp lit inside, had a quality of simple happiness that Cornelius stored carefully in his memory, the way you store provisions for a hard season. Maude reading in the evening, Eli asleep, the fire low and comfortable, and Cornelius looking up from whatever small repair he was managing and finding her looking back at him over her book with those gray-green eyes and a quality of contentment in them that he had not seen there in October and that was becoming more apparent with each passing month. She had not been unhappy before, he thought. She had been managing. Now she was living, and the distinction was showing. In March of 1883, Maude told him she was expecting. She told him in the morning before Eli was awake in the kitchen by the stove, with the directness she applied to everything. She said, "I believe I'm with child. About 2 months, I think. I wanted you to know before I was certain because I thought you'd want to know." He looked at her for a moment, and then he crossed the kitchen and took her face in both his hands and kissed her forehead, and then held her close, carefully, the way you hold something that is precious and also strong enough not to need to be treated as fragile, but that you treat as precious anyway because it is. "Are you well?" he asked into her hair. "I'm perfectly well," she said with some slight amusement. "I've done this before." "I haven't," he said. She pulled back enough to look at him, and something in her expression was very tender in a way she didn't always allow herself to be. "You're going to be a good father," she said simply. He blinked. "How do you know?" "Because you were good to Eli before you had any reason to be," she said. And you kept being good to him after. That's not an act. That's character." She patted his chest once firmly, which was her version of a profound gesture. "Don't worry too much. The pregnancy went well." Maude worked through it with the practicality she brought to everything, making adjustments where necessary and accepting help without too much resistance, which Cornelius understood was itself a form of trust. By summer, she was large and slower and occasionally frustrated by the limitation, and he navigated her impatience with good humor and sense, keeping track of what needed doing without making her feel managed. Eli, when he was told about the coming baby, received the news with his characteristic gravity and said, "I hope it's a brother." "We'll see," Maude said. "I'd accept a sister," Eli said, in the tone of a person making a significant concession. The baby came in November of 1883, late in the month, on a cold night with the wind up outside, and the stove burning hot inside and Clara Finley in attendance, because she had experience with such things and had insisted on being present, for which Cornelius was deeply and permanently grateful. He spent most of the labor in the barn because that was where Maude had told him to go, and she was not the sort of person whose instructions he ignored when they came with a certain quality of delivery. When Clara called him back in, the world had rearranged itself into a new configuration, the way it does after such events. The baby was a boy. He was small and loud and red-faced with the outrage of arrival, and he had Maude's eyes and Cornelius's strong jaw, and was the most thoroughly real thing Cornelius had ever seen in his life. He stood beside Maude's bed and she held out the child to him, and he took him with both hands carefully, the way he had learned to take precious things, and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. "What shall we call him?" he asked. Maude, who was exhausted and clear-eyed and looked, he thought, like the most beautiful person in Barton County, said, "Thomas, for his father before you, and James, if you'd like, for your own father." She paused. "Unless you object to the first." He shook his head. "I don't object. Thomas James Slater, that's a good name." "Tommy," Eli said from the corner, where he had been allowed back in and was regarding his new brother with a mixture of fascination and assessed approval. "I'll call him Tommy." "That seems fair," Cornelius said. Clara Finley was wiping her eyes again, which she did not apologize for, and which was entirely appropriate. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was a full house in every sense. Tommy was a vigorous baby who slept in manageable stretches and ate with enthusiasm, and who was, in the assessment of everyone who encountered him, a person with a great deal of intention. Eli was 10 now and moved through the world with the particular competence of a boy who has been expected to carry himself well and has risen to that expectation. He was also, with Tommy, unexpectedly tender in a way that would have been startling if you didn't know him, careful and patient with the baby in a way that made Maude's eyes go soft every time she saw it. Cornelius and Maude had, through the fall and the pregnancy and the early months of Tommy's life, built between them a partnership so thorough and so grounded that it had become the architecture of everything they did. They still disagreed, because they were both people with strong minds and clear opinions, and Kansas winters are long and close enough to find the friction in any arrangement. But they disagreed in the way people disagree when they respect each other, arguing the thing out and listening to the answer and arriving at something neither would have reached alone. He had done something with the property by spring of 1884 that he was genuinely proud of. With the accumulated Hadley water fees and his labor and Maude's careful management of their finances, they had cleared the primary bank loan. Not reduced, cleared. The paper was paid in full, confirmed in writing by Aldous Prentice, who handled the transaction with the distant professional courtesy of a man who had been outmaneuvered and knew it, and was prepared to be civil about it. Maude filed the confirmation with the county and made the notation in her ledger, and then she set the ledger down and stood at the window of the sod house for a long moment, looking out at the property. Cornelius came to stand beside her. He put his hand on her shoulder. "It's ours," she said, "It's ours," he agreed. She turned and looked at him with those gray-green eyes, and for a moment she was very much the woman he had ridden out to warn on that April morning 2 years before, contained and direct and more complex than a first look could capture, and also very much not that same woman, softer in some places, more certain in others, changed in the way that love and partnership and the addition of new lives genuinely changes people, down into the structure of things. She said, "I'm glad you came." "I'm glad you let me stay," he said. She shook her head slightly. "You didn't exactly leave room for argument. You could have sent me away." "I considered it," she said, with a slight, precise honesty. "For about 30 seconds. What stopped you?" She looked at him for a moment. "You asked me what I planned to do about it," she said, "and then you actually listened to the answer. That was not," she said carefully, "a common experience." He understood what that meant, and he held it with the seriousness it deserved. "It should be," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It should be." He kissed her, there by the window with the morning light coming in, and Tommy making small conversational sounds from his crib in the corner, and somewhere outside Eli arguing cheerfully with Ferdinand about something the mule had no interest in resolving. The years that followed were built on the foundation of that spring. They expanded the sod house in 1885, adding 2 rooms with lumber hauled from the mill in Hayes City. Real wood construction added to the original sod walls, making it larger and more solid. A house that said in the plainest possible terms that the people living in it were not planning to go anywhere. They added a second milk cow. They improved the barn. They planted a windbreak of cottonwoods on the north side of the property that Cornelius said would take 10 years to matter, and Maude said would matter to Tommy and Eli even if not to them, and planted them anyway. Eli turned 16 in 1888 and was by then a young man of considerable capability who had taken on a large share of the physical work of the property, releasing Cornelius for some of the longer-range planning and improvement projects. He was quiet like his mother and steady like his father before him, and had managed, somehow, to absorb the best qualities of both the people who had raised him and make them his own. He rode well, worked hard, went to school in town with the same serious application he gave to everything, and was, to Cornelius's genuine pride, the kind of young man you would want to stand next to in difficulty. He still called Tommy, Tommy, even though by 1888 Tommy was 4 years old and perfectly capable of being called Thomas, and Tommy responded to the name with the expectation of a child who has been loved thoroughly and knows it. A second child had come in 1886, a daughter, born in February during a brief warm spell that lasted just long enough for the event, and then closed back into winter. Maude had named her Ruth, after her own mother, and Ruth had arrived already apparently opinionated about the world, dark-haired and energetic, and in possession of a volume of opinion for an infant that suggested she would be, in due course, an interesting person to know. "She's going to argue with everything," Cornelius said, in the weeks after Ruth arrived, watching her small face work through expressions with the intensity of someone conducting serious negotiations. "Yes," Maude said contentedly. "She'll do well." He looked at his wife and laughed, and she looked back with that specific expression she had that was fond and direct and just slightly amused at the universe, and he thought that he could spend another 50 years looking at that expression and not exhaust it. By 1890, the Carter and Slater Homestead, as it was by then known in the county, was one of the more productive properties in the area. They had found, through careful attention and accumulated experience, what the land could support and what it couldn't, and worked with its nature rather than against it. There was always work, always something that needed doing, always some new challenge of weather or market or equipment to think through. That was the nature of the life they had chosen, and neither of them would have characterized it as easy, but both of them would have characterized it, without reservation, as worthwhile. Eli married in 1892, at 18, a girl from 2 properties east named Alice Drummond, who was 17 and serious-minded in a way that complemented him perfectly. Maude and Cornelius welcomed her into the family with the warmth of people who understood what it meant to find the right person. And Alice, who had been somewhat nervous about her new mother-in-law's reputation for directness, discovered within her first month that the directness was entirely reliable and could be trusted, which was actually more reassuring than its softer alternatives would have been. Eli and Alice built their own small house on the eastern end of the property in the spring of 1893, a proper wood frame house with a good roof, which Cornelius and Eli built together over the course of 2 months in a collaboration that was, in equal parts, technically productive and personally one of the better experiences of Cornelius's life. The morning they finished the roof, the two of them sitting up there eating the lunch Maude had sent out with Tommy, who was 9 now and had made the delivery with great importance, Eli said without particular preamble, "You've been a good father." Cornelius took that in. "You've been easy to father," he said. "Not always," Eli said fairly. "Easier than most," Cornelius said. Eli nodded and looked out across the property, the fields and the garden and the windbreak of cottonwoods that were now, exactly as Maude had predicted, genuinely beginning to matter, their trunks thickened and their shade real and welcome. "Thomas would have liked you," Eli said. "My father, he was a good judge of people." Cornelius was quiet for a moment. "I hope so," he said. They sat on the new roof in the afternoon sun, eating bread and cold chicken, and the property spread out below them in the warm June light, and everything about it was particular and known and theirs. Tommy, it turned out, had an aptitude for numbers, and for the business side of farming that neither Maude nor Cornelius possessed at the same level. And by the time he was 12, it was clear that his future was going to have something to do with the application of that aptitude in ways that would be good for the property and possibly for the region. He was still called Tommy by everyone who knew him, even as he grew taller than Eli by 14 and showed signs of equaling his father's considerable height. Ruth was a force of nature in the most literal sense Cornelius could imagine. At 8, she had organized the children of the neighboring homesteads into a club whose purpose she had defined clearly, and whose rules she had written and pinned to the inside of the barn wall. By 10, she was reading everything in the house, including both almanacs and the law books Maude had acquired after the bank situation, and asking questions of a precision that required the adults around her to actually think before answering. She was, Cornelius thought, going to be extraordinary and possibly exhausting, and both of these things were true of her mother, which he considered proof that the universe had a sense of continuity. He said as much to Maude one evening when Ruth had gone off to bed, having demonstrated, in the space of one supper conversation, an opinion about the county school board's curriculum policy that was both specific and entirely correct. Maude said, "Don't tell her that. She'll be insufferable." "She already knows she takes after you," he said. Maude looked at him with those gray-green eyes that were still, in 1894, the most straightforward and honest thing he had ever seen, and said, "That child is going to change things." "Yes," he said, "I think so too." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, which she still did with the deliberateness of a person who does not lean on things carelessly, and they sat together in the evening outside their house, which was now bigger and sturdier than it had started, and the cottonwoods moved in the evening breeze, and somewhere across the property they could hear Eli and Alice's lamp through their window, a small square of yellow in the dusk. In the summer of 1895, Cornelius turned 44. He did not feel 44 in any of the ways that felt negative, which surprised him and pleased him. He felt, if he was honest, more physically capable than he had at 30 in some respects, more efficient in his movement and more deliberate in his energy, which was what happened when you stopped wasting effort on uncertain things and put it consistently into certain ones. He had a wife he loved completely, and who loved him with an equal completeness that was expressed in the language of their daily life, in the way she handed him his coffee in the morning, and the way she said his name when she was telling him something that mattered. He had 2 children of his blood, one a serious and mathematical young man of 11, and one a force of intellectual nature aged 9. He had a stepson who was a man and a neighbor and a friend, and a daughter-in-law who had become part of the fabric of everything, and he was on good terms with the land beneath him and the sky above it and the creek that ran along its eastern edge. Aldous Prentice had retired from the bank in 1891 and moved to Wichita to live with his daughter. Cornelius did not hold particular animosity toward the man, had never held it, which surprised some people. Prentice had been doing his job and had been outmaneuvered by a better prepared opponent. There was no more personal content in it than that. Grimes the lawyer had taken up practice in another county entirely, and was, by all accounts, doing ordinary legal work of an unremarkable kind. The Hadley family, whose water agreement had been the pivot of the whole original negotiation, were now third-generation neighbors in the genuine sense, the kind of neighbors whose children played with your children and whose word you accepted without paperwork. The First Territorial Bank of Crestwood had changed hands twice and was now run by a younger man named Preston Webb, who lent money in a straightforward way without drama, and to whom Cornelius had extended a small line of credit in 1893 for equipment expansion and had repaid on schedule, establishing a working relationship of mutual respect. The homestead continued. The seasons came through it and went, each one with its particular demands and its particular gifts, and Cornelius and Maude moved through them together with the practiced ease of people who have learned each other down to the grain of things, who know each other's limitations and capacities, and find them not obstacles but elements, the specific material from which a shared life is built. There was one evening in September of 1896 when they were walking the creek bank in the last of the light, just the 2 of them, the way they had walked it since that first summer, checking the water level and the bank erosion and everything else that needed watching, and also just walking because the walking itself was one of the sustained pleasures of their life together. Maude stopped at the place where the creek curved north, the same spot where he had first kissed her 14 years earlier, and she looked at the water moving in the evening light, and then she looked at him. "Do you ever think about where else you might have gone," she asked, "if you hadn't ridden out that April?" He thought about it genuinely because she deserved a genuine answer. "No," he said, "not really, not once, not in any way that has regret in it," he said. "I think about it the way you think about a road you didn't take. You can see it exists, but you can't honestly say it would have been better. This is better. This is my life, the whole of it, including every hard thing." She was quiet for a moment, watching the creek. "I think about where I would have been," she said, "if you hadn't come. If I'd managed the bank on my own, which I would have done, but after that, without you, where would you have been?" he asked. "Still here," she said, "still managing, but lonelier." She looked at him with that direct, clear gaze. "I didn't know how lonely I was until I wasn't. That's not something you can see from inside it." He took her hand. She let him take it, as she always did, with that same deliberateness that meant it was a choice and not a habit, something offered and not assumed. "I was lonely too," he said. "I know," she said. "I could see it. And you let me stay anyway," he said. "I let you stay," she agreed, and her mouth curved in that small, particular way that had first appeared on the afternoon he rode up to warn her, and that still, 14 years and thousands of days later, did the same thing to the inside of his chest as it had done then. They walked back to the house in the long September evening light, hand in hand, and the cottonwoods moved in the last of the day's breeze, and through the open window they could hear Ruth reading aloud to Tommy from some book she had commandeered for the purpose, her clear voice going at full confidence through whatever passage she had selected, and Tommy making occasional interjections that she was summarily overriding, and the 2 of them could hear, underneath the words, the sound of children who were perfectly safe. And it was the best sound in the world. Inside, the lamp was already lit. The supper things were cleared. There was order in the room and warmth from the stove, and a coat of Cornelius's hanging by the door next to Maude's, which was where it had hung for 14 years now, and which looked, in that particular position, exactly as if it had always been there, as if it could not logically be anywhere else. This was the truth of how a life gets built. Not in grand declarations, though there had been a few of those, and not in dramatic rescues, though there had almost been one of those too, but in the daily accumulated evidence of two people who chose each other, repeatedly, in all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that make a life what it is. The land around Crestwood, Kansas, in 1896 was not gentle. It had never been gentle. It asked things of the people who lived on it continuously and without apology, and rewarded effort without sentimentality. You could love it and work it and still have a hard year. You could do everything right and lose to weather. You could plan carefully and be surprised by something you hadn't planned for. But you could also wake up every morning to the same good sky and the same good land and the same person beside you, and have coffee made by someone who knows how you take it and work done beside someone who understands what the work means, and come home in the evening to children who are fed and growing and themselves in the fullest possible sense. You could have all of that in Kansas in 1882 and beyond, if you were willing to do the work and stay when it was hard and let someone in when they rode up unexpectedly one afternoon to warn you about the bank. Cornelius Slater had ridden out to warn a woman he barely knew, had found she knew already, and had stayed to help her answer the door. He had stayed well past that door, through all the other doors that followed, through every season and every difficulty, and every moment of grace this particular, stubborn, beautiful life had produced. He had never once in 14 years wished he had kept riding. And Maude Carter, who had been managing alone for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like not to manage alone, had looked at the man on the roan horse and seen something she recognized, though she could not have named it that afternoon, something steadfast and honest and genuinely present, something that did not require her to be smaller or simpler in order to be worth staying for. She had let him stay. She had let him in. She had, in her particular and deliberate way, loved him as completely as a person of her nature was capable of loving anyone, which turned out to be considerably more than most people managed. It was enough, more than enough. It was, by any honest measure, everything. The evening settled around the Carter and Slater homestead the way Kansas evenings do, broad and slow, and full of a quiet that isn't silence, but is better the sounds of a working property, of children and animals, of wind through cottonwood branches, of two people moving through the house with the ease of long familiarity, making the small preparations for another night, and another morning after that, and all the long and ordinary and irreplaceable days still coming, still ahead, still theirs.